Everyone, hello and welcome in. Another weekend has come and gone. It is once again Monday. We are back to the grind, and we find ourselves today in the middle of a rather oppressive heat wave. At least in Northeast Ohio right now, it's about 90 degrees with some serious humidity. I know places are scorching much harder than this right now, specifically the Pacific Northwest. So hopefully wherever you are and viewing from, staying hydrated, staying cool are your top priorities. Having said all of that, today we turn up the heat on the Minnesota Vikings front office by reacting to a story that was published in Bleacher Report today by author Gary Davenport, who summarizes the riskiest moves of the offseason for all 32 NFL teams up until this point. Now, we're not going to go through all of them. We're just focusing on the Minnesota Vikings. But briefly, I do want to mention some of the observations he has made, some of the choices he has made for other teams, because some of these are pretty obvious, right? Like the Indianapolis Colts trading for Carson Wentz. That's pretty risky. The Green Bay Packers playing chicken with Aaron Rodgers. That's pretty risky. That is putting their season definitely in jeopardy. Some of them aren't as crystal clear, like the Miami Dolphins trading up for Jalen Waddle. That's pretty subjective. The Cleveland Browns not re-signing Sheldon Richardson. That's pretty subjective in and of itself, because I think the Browns have some significant pieces for the interior defensive line that if they pan out, they won't miss Sheldon too much. Other ones aren't so obvious at all. If you weren't really a fan of that team, the one he chose for the Los Angeles Chargers would be not addressing the edge rusher position opposite of Joey Bosa. Now, me not being a Chargers fan probably wouldn't have thought of that. So it's definitely an interesting article. If I remember to, I will link it in the description below, but we are focused on the Minnesota Vikings. And as I was scrolling through the article and reading along, waiting until it got to the Vikings, because this was presented in alphabetical order, so I had a while to go. But I started thinking, okay, what's he going to pick? Is it going to be, something about, Hunter's contract? Is it going to be something about, just something they did in the draft? But what he ended up picking was, as the riskiest move of the 2021 offseason so far, is the Vikings ignoring the wide receiver position. And spoiler alert, it's in the title, so it took me about 2 minutes just to tell you that. But anyway. So he went with the Vikings ignoring the wide receiver position so far this offseason. And now I know you're thinking, what about Smith-Marsette? Well, we'll get to that here in a minute. So the article makes some very valid points to back up this claim, and it's nothing that we haven't talked about already, right? So initially he addressed the depth behind Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, and claiming that it is not that much. And I agree with that. Chad Beebe isn't scaring anybody, as he says. BC Johnson has had flashes here and there, but albeit his career is not going to be really all that much when all is said and done, I predict, because he is fighting just to stay relevant on this depth chart, which already doesn't have a lot of premier talent behind the top two dogs. He goes on to talk about the injury history of Adam Thielen, which is significant these past 2 seasons. He has missed some time, most notably the half a dozen games he missed with the hamstring problem in 2019. He also mentions that the Vikings did draft Smith-Marsette, but they waited until the 5th round to do so. And it's always the thing with the NFL draft, a sort of criticism that when you identify a position of need or a position that you could strengthen, the longer you wait to do so, the more criticized you get for that decision to wait on a position or a specific player. It's just something that comes with the nature of the NFL draft. So later in the Vikings portion of this article, he does kind of contradict himself by saying that Dalvin Cook and Irv Smith Jr. are also on this team, and they are definitely more than capable pass catchers that can have a very significant presence this year in the Minnesota Vikings passing offense. But he does seem to be very hung up and very concerned with the idea that if Adam Thielen or Justin Jefferson were to go down with an injury and miss significant time, that would rattle the position group, because there is just not that much depth. And to which I agree, starting BC Johnson or Chad Beebe for X number of weeks, where X is greater than 1, would be very concerning and something that I don't want to deal with at all. So there's a lot that we have talked about in this article. My reaction to this, my thoughts and opinions on this. So there's a couple things here. I think number one is context, right? Because when you talk about the Minnesota Vikings and you talk about their offense, this is an offense that operates under a very specific style of play where they do a lot of run zone blocking and 2 tight end sets. And they're often in formations where there are 2 tight ends on the field. So I don't want to say rarely, but less often than most teams, I think, in the modern NFL era of a significant amount of passing in this league. They're not doing that all that much, right? I think Kirk Cousins has had the fewest number of passing attempts. And I forget what the statistic is, but it's like the fewest number of passing attempts in so many seasons, or maybe since he joined the team. I don't remember the exact stat, but long story short, Vikings don't pass as much as everybody else in the league. So the context here is that lack of wide receiver depth outside of injuries, and injuries is kind of, a lazy analysis point because injuries happen to everybody and they happen all the time. Everyone has to deal with those. So the fact that we're concerned over something that's out of our control isn't necessarily something that I would call constructive criticism. That is just something that you can really easily point to any positional group on any NFL team and say, yeah, this is a concern. You guys don't have a lot of depth here. What if an injury happens? Injuries happen all the time. I mean, just look at this defense last year that completely got wiped out by injuries. And there's just nothing you can do about it. I remember when Eric Hendricks went out of that game towards the end of the season, and then he never came back. And it's like, yeah, this is definitely a problem because our linebacker group is now decimated, and we are starting guys we picked up off the street a few weeks ago. So injuries are a thing. Everybody has to deal with them. I don't think that that's a very good indicator of a problem, if you will, because you're predicting something that hasn't happened yet. Also in this context, as I briefly mentioned, this is a run-first team, right? This is a run-first, play defense. Kirk Cousins isn't going to throw it a whole bunch. At least that's not their ideal scenario, and that's not the game plan that they really want to do. They want to control the clock, hand off to Dalvin Cook, 20, 25 times a game, play really good defense, win field position battle. So, the fact that we're not lining up 3-4 wide receiver sets unless we're playing from behind or it's late in the game isn't something that's too concerning. Overall, I agree that lack of wide receiver depth currently is an issue, but I don't think it's the biggest issue that the Vikings currently face heading into the 2021 season. There are 4 more areas of concern that I've identified as riskier moves that the Vikings have made or have not made this past offseason up until this point, than ignoring the wide receiver position. Those are, in no particular order, not being able to sign a veteran offensive lineman, I think, is a huge risk going into the season, where the number one complaint, especially from Kirk Cousins defenders, is that we haven't given him adequate passing protection. Couple that with the fact that Garrett Bradbury, a former first overall pick, 18th overall, has had one of the worst pass blocking grades by PFF. I believe it was 38 out of 100. And then we are potentially starting 2 rookies at the left tackle position, number 1, which is one of the more critical positions on the offensive line, and then a right guard in Wyatt Davis, who should beat out Dakota Dozier, we hope. And it's also, significant to note that the only free agents we were able to sign on the offensive line were our own guys, Rashad Hill and Dakota Dozier. Dakota Dozier, I'm sure, is a nice guy, but I'm pretty sure no Vikings fan wanted to see him return, but he is here. Signing 2 nose tackles to play up front and the interior of the defensive line. Now, Michael Pierce was already here. They bring in Dalvin Tomlinson, didn't have a good enough 3 technique in Shamar Stephen or Jaleel Johnson. Those 2 are both out of Minnesota. Bring in Dalvin Tomlinson, who is not a traditional 3 technique pass rusher. He's more of a nose tackle, so we will have 2 nose tackles playing in the interior defensive line. I think that's kind of a risky calculation there. Taking a chance on Patrick Peterson is arguably a huge risk. That could definitely backfire in the greatest way imaginable. We don't know which version of this all-pro corner that we're going to get. Is it going to be the guy we have seen take significant steps back in his career at this point over the last 2 years in Arizona? He seems to be rejuvenated on a personal level, so hopefully that carries over to on the field. And then the last one, which I think is probably the riskiest move that the Vikings have made this offseason, and if I were writing an article for all 32 NFL teams, this is the one that I would give the Vikings. I think the riskiest move so far this offseason is not having an established kicker, because one of the really aches and pains that we had last year was special teams, and it was really capped off by Dan Bailey missing all those kicks versus Tampa Bay, a game that we probably should have won. And Tampa Bay goes on to win the Super Bowl. We go on to finish 7-9. At that point, the special teams hadn't cost them a game yet, and then that was the one that did it. So I think going into a season where you have all these expectations, you have this completely rebuilt defense, you go out and you address the offensive line with prime draft picks, really good draft capital was spent on the offensive line. You're trying to correct things that did not work in the previous year. You get veteran presence on the defense. You spend on defense. I understand the kicking position. It's bugging here. I understand the kicking position is not the be-all, end-all of a football team, and you really shouldn't be relying on your kicker to win you games and whatnot, but still, at the same time, I mean, Greg Joseph, I don't know about that. It boggles my mind, especially after last year. So let me know what you think in the comments below. What has been the riskiest offseason move so far for the Minnesota Vikings? Do you agree with the lack of attention to the wide receiver position? Or do you agree with any of those other four? Not being able to sign a veteran offensive lineman, the kicker situation, Patrick Peterson. What is it? So let me know. Thank you very much for watching the video. That's going to do it for this one. I will see you in the next one.